Could a single strike deep inside Russia's northern heartland signal the collapse of its long-guarded sense of security? At precisely 4:31 a.m. on October 4, 2025, a violent flash tore through the mist above Lake Onega, shattering what the Kremlin believed to be an impenetrable sanctuary. Moments later, the $184 million Grad, a Buyan-M class missile carrier designed for coastal warfare, was ablaze. The explosion illuminated the 227-kilometer White Sea-Baltic Canal, a corridor linking the Arctic to St. Petersburg. For decades, it had been a symbol of Moscow's strategic depth, yet now it had become the stage for humiliation. Satellite images analyzed by BBC Verify hours later showed black smoke curling over the lake, and commercial radar tracking confirmed a sudden cessation of vessel movement in the region. According to Reuters, Russian authorities temporarily halted traffic along the canal, citing technical maintenance, while independent maritime observers reported a massive oil slick spreading from the blast site. Was this merely a symbolic strike, or a new chapter in Ukraine's campaign to cripple Russia's inland logistics? Initial reports indicated that Ukraine's planners had waited for weeks to catch the Grad in motion. Intelligence suggested the ship had been relocated from the Black Sea to the safer northern waterways, following Ukraine's escalating drone assaults on Sevastopol. The U.S. Naval Institute later noted that this redeployment mirrored a wider Russian strategy to shield valuable assets behind internal lakes, as outer defenses strained under Ukrainian pressure. Yet this time, the shelter itself turned fatal. Witnesses along the Karelia shoreline described a thunderous roar, followed by tremors that shattered windows kilometers away. Regional officials dismissed the incident as a fuel explosion, but open-source investigators using thermal imaging detected a clear heat spike consistent with an air-launched munition impact. The attack's precision astonished analysts at Defense News, who suggested that Western satellite reconnaissance may have quietly assisted Kyiv's targeting process, although NATO publicly maintained that its role remained non-operational. Still, Trump-era defense officials in Washington emphasized that technological support for Ukraine's self-defense remains consistent with alliance commitments. The destruction of the Grad reverberated far beyond the lake's borders. Economists at DW Business estimated that repairing the damage to canal infrastructure and lost cargo movements could cost Russia tens of millions of dollars within weeks. For a country already bleeding from sanctions and shrinking energy exports, even a localized disruption like this rippled through its logistics web. Every immobilized barge meant delayed military supplies to the Arctic bases and less revenue from mineral shipments, vital to regional budgets. For Ukraine, the strike represented more than tactical brilliance, it was psychological warfare. By bringing the fight to Russia's interior, Kyiv demonstrated reach resilience and the ability to weaponize intelligence with near-surgical precision. Western analysts began referring to it as the Onega Doctrine, a proof that no corner of Russia's geography is immune to the modern networked battlefield. Yet beneath the triumph lay an even larger question for both sides. If a $184 million vessel could be destroyed 1,000 kilometers from the front line, what remained of Russia's deterrence credibility? NATO observers privately warned that such internal vulnerabilities might push Moscow toward harsher escalation, possibly redeploying air defense assets away from occupied Ukrainian territories to guard its own hinterland. That trade-off, experts noted, could reshape the next phase of the war entirely. As dawn settled over the burning waters of Lake Onega, only fragments of the Grad's hull remained visible above the oily waves, a grim monument to Russia's fading illusion of depth. But this was only the beginning. Somewhere in Kyiv, a chain of analysts was already tracking the next anomaly on their radar screens, another pulse inside Russia's northern communication network. What signals were they about to uncover, and how far into Russia's interior would the next wave strike? What if the key to striking deep into Russia wasn't brute force, but listening patiently, invisibly, across thousands of kilometers of encrypted airwaves? In early September 2025, weeks before the Lake Onega blast, Ukraine's Buyan-M signal intelligence complex buried somewhere near Poltava intercepted an anomaly. For months, its operators had mapped the static rhythm of Russia's military radio networks. Then suddenly a burst appeared from an unexpected location near the Finnish border on a frequency normally reserved for the Black Sea Fleet. That single signal set off a chain reaction. Within hours, Ukraine's satellite imagery command in Kyiv, using both commercial SAR constellations and NATO-supplied reconnaissance feeds, began scanning ship movements on the White Sea-Baltic Canal. Analysts from BBC Verify later confirmed that the channel between St. Petersburg and the White Sea had shown unusual nocturnal vessel activity for over a week. How had such a sensitive asset traveled unnoticed through Russia's inland waters? Western experts suggest this was not a mistake, but overconfidence. According to Defense News, Russian commanders assumed that distance equaled safety, that NATO radar from Norway and the UK couldn't peer into these forest-covered waterways. Yet modern synthetic aperture sensors coupled with open-source maritime tracking erased that margin. Strategic depth no longer exists in the 2020s, noted retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Daniel Hawkins on Reuters' Worldview, only degrees of exposure. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate GUR corroborated the satellite data with human sources. A covert ghost cell operating near Petrozavodsk confirmed that the warship was indeed the Grad freshly repainted and refitted, its crew reduced and its defenses dormant. The leak reportedly came from a contractor frustrated by unpaid wages, a reminder that corruption within Russia's defense apparatus continues to erode operational secrecy. At the same time, analysts at Al Jazeera English reported that the United States European Command had intensified aerial surveillance in northern Europe, not to intervene directly, but to ensure regional stability. Though Washington officially denied involvement, Trump's administration publicly praised Ukraine's discipline and ingenuity, framing it as proof that Western investment in autonomous warfare technologies was paying off. From Kyiv's perspective, the intercept was a golden opening. For months, Ukrainian commanders had debated whether to extend operations beyond the Black Sea. The Grad's relocation offered a symbolic and strategic target, a demonstration that even Russia's inland fleet could not hide. If we can reach their myth of safety, we can fracture their confidence, one Ukrainian official told The Guardian under condition of anonymity. As these insights coalesced, planners faced an agonizing question: how to deliver a strike without triggering Russia's S-400 umbrella protecting St. Petersburg. The answer lay in deception, not mass. Kyiv's engineers began assembling a trio of drones designed for endurance, stealth, and chaos, a combination that would redefine aerial warfare over Russia's north. By late September, Ukrainian intelligence had mapped the radar frequencies of regional air defense sites, using data quietly shared by sympathetic Baltic states. Inside the Joint Intelligence Center in Rzeszów, Poland, NATO analysts simulated potential flight paths, calculating radar gaps across Russia's tundra belt. Officially, NATO maintained plausible deniability, yet their fingerprints, data correlations, timing models, and predictive analytics were visible in every pixel of Kyiv's operation plan. As autumn clouds rolled over, Karelia, Ukraine's strike team finalized its algorithmic route. They had one chance to exploit the radar blind spots north of Tver Oblast, one window, before Russia rotated its air defense coverage. The signal from that northern transmitter had exposed not just a ship, but a structural weakness in Moscow's command architecture, a blind artery pulsing in the open. Now that Ukraine knew where the Grad slept, how would it craft a weapon capable of breaching Russia's shielded skies without ever being seen? Could the same engineering that builds ships also be reversed to trick the sensors that guard them? Kyiv's planners answered that question with a design both elegant and brutal, a layered deception that turned Russia's own radar doctrine into a liability. Within weeks of confirming the Grad's position, Ukrainian weapons engineers finalized a strike package centered on the Lyuty long-range strike drone, escorted by 2 Banshee LR electronic warfare decoys, machines optimized not to win dogfights, but to steal attention. Question for viewers: if you were designing a drone to slip past the S-400 umbrella, what single feature would you insist on? The Lyuty was small, blunt, and precise, a 200-kilometer range platform carrying a 75-kilogram shaped charge warhead built to terminally identify and exploit weak points in small warship hulls. What made Lyuty lethal was not just payload, but guidance. Kyiv engineers layered inertial navigation INS with a hardened multi-band GNSS link and a high-resolution electro-optical infrared seeker for terminal recognition and targeting. The result, a weapon that could navigate through intense jamming, then visually confirm its objective in the final seconds. Defense analysts at Defense News compared the approach to modern cruise missile architectures, but stressed the novelty, Lyuty's cost efficiency, and distributed autonomy made it both affordable and scalable. Flanking Lyuty were the Banshee LRs, long-winged, louder, and intentionally conspicuous. Their job was simple deception, to emit targeted short-duration spot jamming pulses and create radar clutter, drawing local air defense operators to intercept an obvious threat. Once the Pantsir and short-range batteries locked on the Banshees, Lyuty would slip through the radar's lower lobes, several kilometers behind, exploiting geometry and timing. A retired NATO EW officer later told Reuters that such tactics amount to surgical theater, create a showpiece to mask the knife. Western involvement, public and private, shaped the blueprint. Open-source analysis and reporting from BBC, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera indicated that Kyiv benefited from access to high-resolution commercial SAR imagery, synthetic tracking algorithms, and defensive gap models shared by allied defense houses tools that NATO governments described as permissible under current assistance frameworks. The White House, under President Donald Trump, issued guarded praise. Washington reiterated its support for Ukraine's right to defend crucial supply lines, while publicly denying direct operational control. Military experts in London and Brussels, however, acknowledged privately that data flows from Allied reconnaissance services materially improved Kyiv's targeting fidelity. The strike package also reflected a strategic calculus: expendables for effect. A handful of decoy drones and one relatively inexpensive guided drone could neutralize a multi-million-dollar corvette and force a reallocation of priceless S-400 and medium-range assets. Analysts at DW ran cost exchange models showing that even a small uptick in such operations would force Moscow to choose between thinning frontline coverage or erecting denser internal defenses, both outcomes favorable to Ukrainian operational aims. This arithmetic, cheap drones versus expensive air defense, recast escalation as an economic, not merely kinetic, contest. Weapon comparisons proliferated in the Western press. Lyuty versus cruise missiles, Banshee-style decoys versus traditional chaff and electronic countermeasures. The consensus: Ukraine had blurred the line between tactical drones and strategic effectors. By fusing low-cost platforms with networked intelligence, Kyiv had created a tool set that rendered strategic depth operationally porous. As Kyiv finalized its flight corridors, algorithmic timing became crucial. One misstep, one rotated radar sweep, and the whole plan would fail. In the command van outside, Kyiv mission controllers watched telemetry streams like surgeons studying vitals. The deceptive ballet had only one act: left a night flight into Karelia across radar gaps into the soft underbelly of a warship that believed itself safe. What would happen when the decoys drew the eyes of Russia's defenders and the knife struck seconds later? Could a handful of drones set an entire naval doctrine ablaze in under a minute? In the small hours, the operation reached its crescendo. Lyuty and its two Banshee LR escorts slipped into Karelia's cold sky, an engineered deception timed to the second. Ground stations in Kyiv watched streams of telemetry. Operators in the command van held their breath as the decoys drew the eyes and the hunter prepared to strike. Question for viewers: if you were in command in St. Petersburg that night, what would you have ordered? Shoot the decoys or hold fire and risk the unknown? The plan worked with brutal economy. The Banshees flashed into radar screens as obvious low-altitude threats and triggered a rapid visible response from a local Pantsir battery. Operators focused on intercepting the louder signatures. Behind that stagecraft, Lyuty, flying lower, colder, and far quieter, slid into the radar's blind arc and began its terminal run. Kyiv's designers had stacked guidance layers to defeat jamming and spoofing. The Lyuty relied on inertial guidance, hardened GNSS, and a final EO/IR seeker to visually lock the Grad in the last seconds. This technical choreography is laid out in the operation file's mission notes, which describe the three-layer guidance and the timing used to exploit radar geometry. At 0430 local time, the seeker found the target. The Grad's cooled engines still emitted a trace signature that the seeker matched to its library. In a dive measured to the second, the Lyuty struck the ship's power compartment. Witnesses later described a concentrated, almost surgical blast, followed by secondary conflagrations as fuel and munitions cooked off. The immediate aftermath left the corvette a burning skeleton and the lake surface slick with oil and debris. Open-source thermal data corroborated a terminal impact profile consistent with a small guided munition rather than a larger cruise missile. Western analysts quickly cataloged what had taken place as more than a hit on a single warship. Defense economics models running through NATO-linked think tanks showed an immediate multiplier effect. Canal traffic suspended, commercial shipments delayed, and regional repair yards diverted to emergency salvage costs that ripple into Russia's already strained logistics and energy exports. A defense news-style analysis widely referenced among Allied capitals argued that the economics of the strike were intentional expend low-cost autonomy to force Moscow into expensive defensive trade-offs. President Donald Trump's administration, while publicly cautious, underscored that Allied technology and intelligence flows had narrowed the time from detection to strike, a fact NATO officials admitted in private briefings as they weighed whether to further harden regional surveillance. Operationally, Moscow faced two terrible choices: overnight pull precious S-400 and medium-range assets back from the front to defend interior lines, thereby weakening occupied sector air defenses, or leave interior nodes exposed and accept that Kyiv could continue to manufacture strategic shocks. Analysts in London and Brussels warned the Kremlin's dilemma would accelerate, not contain, Russia's operational fatigue, precisely Kyiv's intended strategic logic. Back on the ground in Karelia, the psychological result was immediate. Local elites and military planners who once treated inland waterways as sacrosanct began to ask whether any harbor could now be called safe. That uncertainty spread faster than any formal statement from Moscow, penetrating encrypted channels and private conversations among officers. As smoke rose over Onega and the canal authorities began emergency repairs, a new question loomed for both capitals: would Ukraine press this success into sustained pressure on Russia's internal lines? Or was this a single dramatic message meant to unnerve rather than to sustain a campaign? The answer would determine whether the war's geography was permanently redefined or whether Moscow could close the window before Kyiv found a second soft target. Could centuries of Russian strategic thinking collapse because a cheap guided drone found a window in a sleepy inland lake? The strike on the Grad forced that question into the open. A single precision-guided munition turned an inland waterway, once a symbol of invulnerability, into a theater of vulnerability. Kiev's success was not only tactical, but conceptual. It exposed the obsolescence of the old strategic depth doctrine in the face of networked sensors and affordable autonomy. Ukraine's claim that the Buyan-M corvette was struck on Lake Onega has been widely reported and analyzed. Viewer question early: did Russia ever truly have a safe rear area, or was that always a myth waiting for modern tech to burst it? The immediate military calculus was stark. Analysts in Western capitals ran cost exchange models within hours. A $75,000 or lower guided drone Likuti class could destroy a multi-million-dollar naval asset and force Moscow to redeploy air defense systems or accept further hits. That economic asymmetry, cheap drones forcing expensive countermeasures, now defines the battlefield. Recent specialist reporting on drone cost dynamics and defense economics argues that this imbalance will compel conventional powers to rethink force structure and homeland defense spending. Strategic consequences unfolded along three linked vectors. First, logistics. The White Sea-Baltic Canal is a choke point for both military repositioning and commerce. Any sustained interdiction would ripple into mineral exports and Arctic supply chains, increasing costs and bottlenecks for Russia's northern fleet and civilian shippers alike. Maritime commentators noted immediate stoppages and salvage needs after the strike. Second, force posture. Moscow now faces the classic lose-lose trade-off. Pull S-400s and medium-range assets back from front lines to harden interior nodes, weakening the occupied zone air defense umbrella, or keep those assets forward and accept interior vulnerability. Western defense planners privately warned that either choice accelerates Russian operational strain. Allied analysts say such dilemmas are precisely what Kiev's long-range strikes aim to create. Third, escalation risk. NATO intelligence and European capitals are monitoring whether Moscow will respond by expanding kinetic reach, intensifying cyber attacks, or leveraging partners to refill its air defense inventory. Headlines and expert commentary have already flagged the possibility of stronger hybrid retaliation. Germany's security services and NATO-linked think tanks are vocal about rising Russian adaptive measures across cyber and military domains. Western experts are blunt. The war economy is shifting. Cheap, mass-produced drones and smarter targeting chains transform attrition into an economic contest. Ukraine buys or builds low-cost autonomy. Russia must buy expensive, scarce interceptors or accept strategic shocks. Defense analysts say this dynamic compresses decision cycles and forces political leaders into riskier gambits. Politically, the optics are poisonous for Moscow. Elites who once relied on the buffer of geography must now confront the reality that wealth and distance no longer guarantee safety. That psychological effect, loss of confidence among officers, bureaucrats, and oligarchs, can be as damaging as any sunk cost. NATO planners note that this internal erosion increases the alliance's strategic leverage, but also raises the specter of unpredictable escalation from a cornered Kremlin. If the Onega strike marks a turning point, the question becomes tactical and moral. Can Kiev convert a single spectacular success into sustainable pressure without provoking uncontrollable escalation? The world is watching as Moscow weighs whether to fortify its interior or gamble everything to hold the line. Will Russia accept a new costly defensive posture, or will it lash out in ways that redraw Europe's strategic map? Could one inland strike force a cornered Kremlin into choices that unravel its entire campaign? Within hours of the Lake Onega blast, panic rippled through Moscow's corridors of power. The Grad's destruction was not merely a tactical loss. It was an existential signal that Ukraine's reach now pierced sanctuaries once thought inviolable. As smoke rose over the canal, generals and ministers faced a stark calculus: reinforce interior defenses and bleed the front or hold the front and let the hinterland burn. Viewer question early if you were advising the Kremlin. Now would you prioritize shielding supply lines or preserving frontline firepower? The immediate symptoms were bureaucratic and chaotic. Defense dispatches from several Northern Fleet installations were rerouted. Maintenance schedules for S-400 batteries were accelerated. Trains loaded with spare interceptors were diverted from Western fronts, back toward St. Petersburg and Murmansk. Western reporting outlets documented a flurry of emergency procurement requests and classified orders to reposition assets moves that NATO intelligence tallied as a seismic internal rebalancing. Analysts at think tanks in London and Washington estimated that even a limited redeployment of S-400 batteries could leave hundreds of kilometers of occupied Ukrainian airspace more exposed, a scenario Ukrainian commanders had long sought. Economically, the one-off blast had immediate ripple effects. Canal closures delayed the shipment of nickel and timber that feed state coffers and foreign contracts. Regional insurers flagged sharply higher premiums for Arctic transits. Salvage and infrastructure repair bills began to mount. Experts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies warned that repeated hits on inland choke points would compound sanction pressures and accelerate revenue shortfalls for regional budgets dependent on extractive exports. NATO economists watching the data said the strike's strategic value lay less in tonnage sunk and more in the financial hemorrhage it forced Russia to accept to restore perceived safety. Politically, the strike cut deeper. Private messaging channels in St. Petersburg and Moscow suddenly filled with anxiety. Oligarchs questioned port security. Governors demanded clearer Kremlin directives, and mid-ranking officers fretted about inadequate readiness. The social contract that loyalty would be rewarded with security appeared frayed. Western analysts argued that sustained psychological pressure on elites could erode cohesion at the very top, compelling leaders to make risk-laden policy choices to reassure domestic audiences. President Donald Trump's administration framed the situation in Washington as an example of Kyiv's ingenuity, reiterating support while urging allies to calibrate assistance to avoid uncontrolled escalation. NATO spokespeople walked a narrow line, reaffirm intelligence cooperation and surveillance support, but publicly deny direct operational involvement. Military commentators warned of the escalation traps ahead. If Moscow thinned front lines to protect interior nodes, Ukraine would likely press offensives where air cover weakened. If Moscow fortified the rear, it risked ceding operational tempo in occupied territories. Cyber and hybrid retaliation, targeting banking, energy grids, and logistic databases, also loomed as cost-effective escalatory options. Western experts pointed to a new arithmetic. Russia's choices were no longer binary. Each defensive move created asymmetric openings for Kyiv and its backers. As night fell on the smoldering canal, planners in Kyiv and allied centers watched Moscow wrestle with its options. The Onega strike had done more than sink a ship. It had forced a strategic dilemma on an entire apparatus. The next chapter would hinge on whether Kyiv could convert momentary shock into sustainable pressure without provoking a wider, uncontrollable spiral. What will Moscow choose, and will that choice hand Kyiv the operational space it needs to change the war's trajectory?